May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our collective hearts be pleasing and acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. We are standing on holy ground, and I know that there are angels all around. Let us praise Jesus now. We are standing in his presence on holy ground. I stepped off the sidewalk onto the green grass in front of the church. Holy ground by most standards, but especially to me. You see, I was standing in the place where I had once heard God calling me into ministry. That ground was so holy to me, I probably should have taken off my shoes to show proper respect, just like Moses was asked to do when God spoke to him through a burning bush. But there was no burning bush that day, just a pile of ashes where a church had once stood, recognizable only by the concrete ramp that led up to where the front door used to be. Ashes to ashes, nothing but ashes. It had all burned down, the church and the town around it. A soft drizzle fell on the town of Greenville that day, the rain that everyone had so fervently prayed for during the long and cruel fire season of 2021. Finally it fell, raindrops mixing with my tears as I wept for all that had been lost, a church, a town, a forest, loss upon loss. Even as I mourned, I knew that there was resurrection and new life ahead. The congregation of Greenville plans to rebuild their church to stand once again as a beacon of hope in the new town that will be built to replace the old one. Even the green grass under my feet, freshly sprouted since that recent fire, reminded me of how quickly new life springs up in the wake of death. Life persists, insists, resists the devastation of even the most ravaging fire. Grasses will regrow, and trees and churches and towns. The sacred breath of life returning, for the creator of all things is both Alpha and Omega, claiming the final word. I knew all of this, and still I wept because I felt grief, and there is only one cure for grief, the act of grieving. The tears I shed in that ruined holy place were not merely symptoms of my grief, but medicine. It calls to mind a story from the 11th chapter of the Gospel of John. Jesus had been summoned by his friends Martha and Mary, for their brother Lazarus was sick and on the verge of death. Mary and Martha fervently believed that Jesus could heal their beloved brother, but he was too late. By the time he got there, Lazarus had been dead for 4 whole days. He had been placed in the tomb, and the ritual of mourning was well underway. If we read the whole chapter carefully, we can see that Jesus knew exactly how this story would end, and maybe you do too. Jesus raises Lazarus from the tomb. It's a miracle. And yet, even knowing that he was about to restore life and wholeness to his dear friend and lift the impossible burden of grief from the 2 women who were also his dear friends, do you know what Jesus did? He wept. Listen to how John tells the story and see if you can tell why. I'll start at verse 32. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, Where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. So Jesus began to weep. And the Jews said, See how he loved him. But some of them said, Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Yes, he could have. And of course, we who know the rest of the story know that he is about to open Lazarus's eyes from the sleep of death. And still, Jesus wept. Why? For what was Jesus weeping? What do you think? Perhaps he wept to see his friends in pain. Perhaps he wept because he understood that this miracle of resurrection would seal his fate from those who feared him to have become too powerful. They would never let him live once he had demonstrated having that much power. Perhaps he wept knowing that even after his own death and resurrection, people would continue to stubbornly resist the message that he had lived and died to teach. Was Jesus weeping for Lazarus, or for Mary, or for all of humanity? Sometimes tears for one thing beget tears for other things. Has that ever happened to you? Maybe you've been to a funeral and found yourself weeping for other losses you've experienced. You see the bereaved family members and you recall the passing of your own dear ones. It takes you back to that memory and your tears suddenly take on deeper meaning. You might even find yourself crying for all the pain you've ever felt or losses you haven't felt yet. Last summer, I visited the cemetery where my own father's ashes were placed. I had my moment with him, a tearful moment. And then I went next door to the plot next to our families. It belongs to the Hunter family, and we don't know any of them. But my aunt faithfully pulls the creeping Charlie that grows up around the edges of their stones because there is no one left to do it for them. I knelt beside her that day to help her clean up the stones, and as we weeded, we uncovered the story revealed by the dates. One mother and 5 children had all died between April and May of the same year, 1918, a time of pandemic. I could only imagine the sorrow of that mother who watched 1, then 2, then 3, then 4 of her children sicken and die. The 10-year-old, the 5-year-old, the teenager, then the baby. Was that the day her heart broke and she lost hope? And to think of the despair of that last child having lost even his mother before dying himself. The father went on to live another 20 years or so, according to the dates. What that must have been like for him. I cried for that family of strangers bereaved 100 years ago, and then I cried for those who have lost loved ones during our current pandemic. Parents, children, grandparents, a whole world of grief. Knowing why I cried, I think Jesus' tears were necessary. I think even the healer needed to be healed from the deep grief that comes from being human. Maybe even the human incarnation of the divine needed to weep, moved by a love so deep as to feel all the suffering of the world. The only cure for grief is to grieve. Today is a day for us to pause between the busyness of the harvest season and the preparations for the season ahead. After the canning stuff has been put away, but before the Christmas stuff is brought out, this is our time to pause. Take a breath and allow ourselves a moment like we've just seen Jesus take, a moment to grieve. For there is much to lament. Perhaps you've lost someone dear to you in the past year or so. That in itself is reason enough to grieve. And then there is the overwhelming sense of collective loss we feel for the more than 5 million human lives that have been lost worldwide to COVID alone. And these losses are only compounded by the devastation afflicting our planet everywhere we look, whether from fire or flood, earthquake or hurricane. The reality of our situation is hitting hard. Our mother, the earth, is very sick, and we lament. And yet somehow we balance our lament with hope. Just as Jesus' grief was made bearable by his awareness that resurrection was imminent, it wasn't the kind of hope that had him singing for joy. No, not in that moment. Instead, it was the kind of hope that gave him the strength to do everything he could to counter the despair and sorrow of a grieving world. And we who follow Jesus must cling all the more tightly to hope, in spite of the many reasons for despair. In the face of all that is, hope is a rather audacious thing to have, don't you think? Yet it is the trademark of our faith. Jesus came from a long line of people who could have easily given up on hope many times over, and some did. But they were encouraged by the words of their prophets, which led them through their darkest days. Words like lamps, guiding them forward. Might we too be encouraged by the ancient words of the prophet Isaiah, who spoke of a time when God would destroy on this mountain the shroud that is cast over all peoples, the sheet that is spread over all nations. When God would swallow up death forever, then, writes Isaiah, then the Lord God will wipe away the tears from all faces and the disgrace of his people. He will take away from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. It will be said on that day, lo, this is our God. We have waited for him so that he might save us. This is the Lord from whom we have waited. Let us be glad and rejoice in his salvation. God's salvation did come several centuries later through Jesus, whose own resurrection revealed to the world that God can indeed swallow up death forever. And even when we mourn, ours is the God who will wipe away the tears from all faces. Let us remember this, even in our moments of lament. The tears will come. The tears must come, for that is how we heal. But our God, who chose to be present among us in human form, our God who wept with us and for us, gives us reason to hope even now that our story is not finished yet and will not be finished, even by death. This hope was echoed a bit after Jesus' time by John of Patmos, a bishop from the early Christian church who wrote words to encourage the faith communities who were struggling under Roman persecution. Because John's revelation was a heavily symbolic, coded message written specifically for the Christians of his time, it is problematic to apply much of his book to any other context. For that reason, it almost didn't make it into the Bible as we know it, but it was kept, possibly for this one passage which offers us the purest, loveliest hope. I have to share with you this jewel from Revelation, chapter 21, verses 3 through 5, in which John describes his vision of God coming to reign. He wrote, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them as their God. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more. For the first things have passed away." And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." Friends, in the midst of darkness and despair, in scorched forests, in the mangled and ashy remains of burned out homes and towns, in every room where people watch and wait and weep, our loving God wipes every tear from our eyes, leading us forward into a time when suffering and death will be no more. We don't know how, we don't know when, we don't know where, but our faith plants in us seeds of hope that our God is making all things new. Like the soft carpet of grass, which has already sprouted in the front lawn of a church that was and that will be again. I share with you now this musical reflection. In the bulb there is a flower, in the seed an apple tree, in cocoons a hidden promise, butterflies will soon be free. In the cold and snow of winter there's a spring that waits to be unrevealed until its season as we might hold a lit candle, protecting the soft flame that guides us through the darkness.